just don't be afraid to ask. If something doesn't make sense or you don't understand what it is, get them to explain it to you. They are asking you to sign their contract. You need to be clear what it is that you're signing up to.
You're listening to the She Renovates podcast. You're listening to She Renovates, the podcast for women who want to renovate to create an income and a life they love.
Hello everyone, it's Bernadette here. So today's episode is a little bit random. So Stephen and I are stuck in a car for 8 hours driving back from Melbourne to Sydney. And we thought we would take the opportunity to record a podcast. And so the inspiration from this podcast is a conversation that I had with a prospective student yesterday. Lovely lady who had bought a home in Brisbane as their family home and was planning some renovation to improve its value, but also to improve the livability of the property. And she was encountering that feeling of, I think the word is powerlessness, that you get when you are navigating the tendering process with builders. Now, I don't want to bag out all builders, but I think that I'm sure you are aware of this, and this is what we want to talk about. Really, firstly, her experience and the line that she was fed, and then I guess give you some tips on how you can navigate this situation, because it is a bit of a minefield, and we ourselves went through this when we were getting quotes for our own renovation. And so while we've both been in the industry for like 40 years, we still felt like we needed to have some strategies to ensure that we weren't being played. So Stephen's with me as well, and so it will be a bit of a conversation. But I think the first thing I wanted to do is tell you about the conversation that was the inspiration for this. And so basically, this lady was wanting to make some changes to a property to convert a 2-bed, 1-bath into a 4-bed, 2-bath inside the existing building envelope. And so the first thing that happened was that the builder quoted her $13,000 for engineering drawings, which she thankfully picked up was a bit over the top and ended up getting them done for $2,000. And she was removing quite a few walls, and basically what the builder told her was that because she was removing a few walls and the roof was a tiled roof, that she really needed to change the roof to a colour-bond roof, and he estimated that would cost her between $40,000 and $50,000. This is for a very simple gabled roof. Is that what you call it, Stephen? When it's one sort of two planes that join at a gap? Yeah, okay. And which clearly is over the top. And what I wanted to do is just quiz Stephen on some of the, theory around that. So we recently had quite a complex roof done on Echuca, and that was a colour-bond roof, and that was $22,000. So there's a big difference between 22, and I'd say the Echuca one should have really been more expensive, the gabled roof, because it's in two straight planes. But there is a little bit more work when you're going from tile to colour-bond, isn't there?
Yeah, so in actual fact, there's a lot less timber in a colour-bond roof than what there is in a tiled roof, because the rafters are normally anywhere between 900 and 1200 millimetres apart for a tiled roof, for an iron roof, and they would be 600 millimetres apart for a tiled roof. So the only thing that really needs to be changed in that is the battens are different. So tile battens are a very small timber section, something roughly 40, 45 or not even, it's actually about 30 by 25, and each batten just holds the lip of the tile. On a iron roof, it ends up being, because it's actually spanning 9 or 1200 millimetres, depending on it is. You may end up with a 90 by 45 or something like that for a size member, for your batten member. And it also gives you something to screw the iron roof into, so you want a fairly solid member that's not going to split and crack and things like that. So his suggestion that it would cost a lot of money to change it is just really incorrect. It would be just a case of putting some. You could even leave the tile battens in, to be perfectly honest, and just put these other battens alongside it and right spacing. But the other part of that equation is the fact that it would be very unusual that you would even bother changing, because if you're removing a wall and it's a load-bearing wall, you would just simply put a beam or a lintel or LVL, whatever it may be, in to cover that span, and you just leave the roof alone. It's quite uncommon that you would go down the expensive path, and I think the incorrect path, of changing your roof for the sake of putting in some additional members, albeit they may be quite a large member if they're spanning, but you may even have to put a steel beam in occasion. But that still wouldn't be, the equivalent of $30,000 worth of work, not to mention the physical work involved as well. So from a labour and materials point of view, it's just an incorrect approach. Look, had the builder given her an option, said it would cost you X to do this and Y to do the other, and let her make the decision, that would have been a reasonable approach, as long as what he was giving her were factually correct, not just him wanting to do it in a particular way. But yeah, it's a very, very odd approach.
But even so, changing the roof is not going to eliminate the need to support it when you take out a load-bearing wall.
No, absolutely not. So you'd have to put the beams in almost regardless.
Yeah.
The beam may be a little bit less in size because it's not carrying a tiled roof versus an iron roof, but nonetheless, you would still have to put those beams in, regardless of which option you get down.
And the other thing about a iron roof is the fact that you need to include a roofing blanket. Do you do that with tiled roofs? No.
Not quite sure. So they're always sucked. They are more and more now going for insulation on the roof, but I'd have to just check on that, because with an iron roof, depending on the thickness of the insulation, it just gets squeezed down between the battens when you screw the sheets down. With a tiled roof, you almost need to insulate it from underside of the tile or underside of the battens, which is also doable.
Okay, when I pressed her about the changing of the roof, she did say that the tiled roof required some attention. There were tiles missing, needed some repointing and so on. But we've had plenty of roofs like that we've been able to restore.
Yeah, so again, depending on the age of the roofs, there are quite a few demolition contractors or specialist roofing suppliers who actually keep old roofing tiles. As time goes by, they will obviously become harder and harder to get, but unless it's a very old roof or a very unusual profile, you generally can still find replacement tiles. And exactly what happened at Newcastle when we did that roof there.
To be honest with you, I was really surprised that they were able to restore that roof, because some of those tiles were falling to bits, crumbling, because they were concrete. I'm pretty sure this one is terracotta, but the concrete tiles do deteriorate over time, don't they?
Well, because they're an applied glaze that goes on top of it, it's really like a sort of a paint that goes on top of a concrete tile to make it waterproof. That glazing does break down over time. It's different than a glaze on it. And when the glaze wears off, two things happen. One, they absorb water, which makes it become also very heavy and slightly porous. But they also start to disintegrate over time. So they start to crumble and break. And whereas terracotta is just a much more stable, and it's been around for thousands of years, so it's just a different material. Whereas a fairly thin cement product, they just break down. They'll last 30, 40 years, don't get me wrong, but they're not something that's going to last for 100 years or something like that.
Yeah. Well, at Newcastle, we basically got someone that specialises in restoring concrete tiled roofs, and He replaced all the tiles that had broken, repointed the capping, and cleaned it, and then sprayed it with this material that has a 10-year warranty. And the good thing about spraying it is that you can select a colour that has a high R rating, reflectivity, so it'll keep the roof cavity cooler, which I think in these days when we're conscious about energy conservation, that is a good thing to be able to do. And so
and even for the comfort of the home, energy and comfort, it just takes the heat load off. The roof cavity in a house, as you will imagine, unless they're ventilated and other things, can become very, very, very hot.
Yeah.
And so having either a light colour or reflective roof is certainly the way to go.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing to point out here, and we have had a few roofs where with tiles where the roof structure, the timber structure, looked to be sagging a bit. And so I'm wondering whether maybe that's what they saw, because it is a large expanse of roof. But that's just a matter of putting some extra struts in, isn't it?
Yeah, so what does happen with a lot of older roofs, they do move with time. Timbers and members sort of become a little bit unstable, and you can get some buckling, particularly as you just mentioned, which is sort of quite large, sort of a roof plane, which is nice and flat, not flat horizontal, but in one plane. It's often quite easy to see like sort of waves going through it where it goes over the rafters and the battens and things like that. But it's not a huge exercise depending on exactly what the problem is. To either pop a new underpurlin in or an extra timber alongside one of the existing underpurlins, and then all that's really required, that will just push the roof back into its correct position, and there's really very little further action required. It's not a big exercise at all. Sometimes getting the timber members in there are a little bit difficult, because if it's a finished roof, you may have to take some tiles off to be able to slide a new member in. But even through a gable end, you would often just take some panelling off on one end and slide the members in, and then just re-prop them back up using struts off the load-bearing walls.
Yeah.
So
So I think we've done justice to the conversation around the roof. Let's talk about how do we navigate getting quotes from builders for the work that you want done. So I think the first thing that I would say is you want to get lots of quotes, and I know that can be quite challenging. Actually, step even back further than that. I think you also need to know that your builder has a completely different objective to you. So your goal is to get the best outcome possible within a budget, whereas from your builder's point of view, this is their livelihood, and the more money they make out of your deal, the better. And so they're going to be looking for opportunities to upsell or to make more money. So you want to be fairly aware of that with all your dealings. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, and often they just want the easiest option as well.
Yeah.
So for them, time is money. And if something's going to take longer or be more difficult, they're not necessarily that interested. So maybe his thinking was it was easier for them to replace the roof, which is not his trade, it's someone else's problem. And then he would come in and do the easy work afterwards, which would be probably insert a couple of beams in the wall and then move on. I know that would probably mean less work for him in some ways, but it just depends what his rationale is and what he's actually thinking. Having said that, with the quotes that he had, the numbers he was giving doing that work, he would be making some profit out of it. There's no doubt about that. So,
yeah.
So it's also just about time as well. So, yeah.
So just reflecting on our build and how it's gone compared to the contract we've signed, have you got any comments to make about?
Look, I think just your earlier comment about get other quotes, it's a little bit like anything really. You need possibly in the first instance a second opinion. If someone tells you, you've got to rip the roof off, you've got to do this, you think, gee, wow, I hadn't anticipated that, or does that sound right? Sort of get a second opinion. Don't even get another price or get another person, but don't even suggest anything that he has said to them. Say, look, what do you think we need to do here? I'm taking these walls out. And let him lead the conversation on what he thinks it is. And you may get a completely different answer from a different builder. And actually, not may, I'd almost guarantee in this instance they would have got a different answer. So whereas quite often, if based on particular advice, you would then do up a scope and you would get both your builders or as many builders as you're going to get or roofers to quote the job, you need to make sure that what you're asking them to do is what they're all going to be pricing on. And more importantly, is it the right thing that they're pricing on? Because had this lady in this instance gone the other way and said, okay, all right, I'm going to get a second price based on the fact I'm going to take off the roof and put on the iron and all of those sorts of things, she may have ended up with a price of a similar nature just by virtue of the fact that really the scope was wrong.
Yeah.
So, and I know that's often hard to get the right advice, but I think getting second opinions is not a bad idea. I mean, if you think about it, you would do second opinions for, I don't know, surgery or other things in your life. I think
mechanic,
all of those sorts of things, you would get opinions or get reviews or get whatever. And I think you've got to treat this one a little bit the same, where you would sort of say, well, look, okay, appreciate what this guy's saying. He may be right, and in which case I think we need a second opinion. I think that's the first thing, because to get competitive quotes, you need to make sure you're comparing apples for apples and that the scope needs to be quite clearly defined.
So just as a matter of interest, we're driving through Rutherglen at the moment, which is very quaint little Victorian town with some nice Victorian architecture, as in Victorian style architecture. So, yeah, and so I would say get as many quotes as you can. When there is contention and you're not really sure whether they're telling you something that's true, then I'd be trying to get 3, 4, even, and you may not go to the full extent of getting a full-blown quote, but certainly have conversations with as many builders as you can to really flesh out what's what. So the other thing, when you do go down that path, you will be required to sign a building contract. And there are a few things to be aware of when you're doing that. And I thought it will be of value to highlight some of the things that you need to be aware of. And I think the first one is that homeowners warranty insurance, or whatever it's called in your state, by law should be paid first via the builder before a deposit is taken. Okay, so what should happen is that contractor should go off and set up a policy, because that happens through the builder. The builder has a policy and they have an allocation for their work for the year, so they need to allocate what portion is required for your job, and you need to pay the premium on that before anything else happens. And if your building contract happens differently, then it's probably not being done lawfully. So the next thing you'll need to do is check through the contract. Do you want to talk about some common things that you might find in a building contract that are not?
I think maybe first and foremost is just coming back to scope. If he has given you the scope, or you have even originally prepared the scope of what the work would be, make sure that he has included everything that he said or you have asked him to do in the quote. In other words, what a lot of builders do, and this is possibly more so even before you get to the contract, they'll actually prepare a quote and it doesn't include everything you've asked for. And so everything after that will become a variation. And that's the last thing you want. You want the contract to be as complete as it can be. There are some things that builders can't or won't necessarily quote, like, for example, if they don't know if there's asbestos in the building and there's some walls that need to be removed, they'll often put that in as what's called a provisional sum. And if they don't know it's there, it will become a variation. So those sorts of things are reasonable. What's not reasonable, though, if they've physically left out things that they either don't want to do if they don't want to do it, you need to understand that they're not going, and you're not going to get them to do it. That you'll need to allow for someone else to come and do that work. I can't quite think of a good example, but sometimes if you had specialised windows or something like that in a project, they may just exclude them, so we don't do those. And that's fine, but that means that you would need to find a contractor who would, and it would need to be coordinated with those works. But the other thing that they'll do is also PC sums, which are, again, quite reasonable, where what they will do is they don't know what tiles you're going to select, or they don't know what tapware and sanitary ware that you want for your bathrooms, and they'll often just propose a provisional sum. It should be reflective of what a reasonable price would be. So, for example, it's for tiles, they'll probably be allowing, I don't know, $40 a square metre or something along those lines, and that would be able to buy a reasonable tile.
Clearly, Stephen hasn't bought tiles recently. I do all the shopping.
Anyway, if the tiles end up costing $100 a square metre, obviously there's going to be an extra over for that, but the installation cost should still be the same. So it's just a provisional sum, a prime cost item for the tile, the hand basin or the taps or whatever it may be. And again, if you select something outside of that range or well above it, obviously you need to pay extra. But the contract needs to be as complete as you can get it. But most people will tend to use an HIA or one of those types of contracts, which are all fairly standard. I must admit they are a little bit in favour of the...
Yeah, HIA is definitely...
And you need to be mindful of that, but the things you want to be looking for are things around time, and if there is costs associated with that, like say, for example, there is inclement weather and there's delays, so you shouldn't be paying for that. I mean, obviously the job will take longer, but you just need to have a look at what their time clauses relate to in relation to cost, and how that's going to be managed. Also, another thing you need to be really careful with is if you are providing something and they have stated in the contract that they need it by a particular date, you need to make sure that you can achieve that date. Otherwise, don't sign the contract, because they will charge you if they're being delayed, if they're waiting on you to provide something like, let's even say that you decide you're going to supply the kitchen and they're ready to do the splashbacks and do all the second fix electrical and plumbing, and you haven't got your kitchen and bench tops in, they're being delayed. And so if you've agreed to do something and it's written in the contract that you're the supplier of those goods, you need to make sure they're there on the times that they've stated, and they should clearly state when they need them. That might be just in weeks from the start date, on week 12 or something, that they will need to have all the joinery in or something along those lines. And you need to make sure that you can achieve that with your own suppliers that you're working with. Look, you can talk all day about contracts, to be quite honest. There.
Do you want to comment on variations before you wrap up?
Well, look, I think most important thing with variations, you will get variations in the job. It's almost impossible not to. Things maybe new builds are a little bit different, but when you're doing renovations, there's always something that no one knew about, or they start taking something up and you end up with a different situation. The first thing is it should always be agreed in writing. So they should provide a quote for you, let you know what's involved, and then agree it. So what you don't want is surprises. You don't want to get to the end of having done some work, you thinking in your head this is a $5,000 problem, and then coming and saying, well, in actual fact, it was $20,000. So there's no reason why they can't provide an accurate quote for those works. Even look, there might be a little bit up or a little bit down, but what you don't want is to have a situation where the price blows out to double or treble what you or they said it was going to cost. So I think from that point of view, variations will look, but having it in writing, having a clear understanding, not just sort of at a meeting saying, yeah, look, quick, just proceed, but that's all good, we'll worry about it later. To say, look, this is a variation, we all appreciate it's a variation, it's a change of scope, what's it going to cost? And if he says, oh, look, I'm going to go out, I'm going to get quotes, this, fine, give me an estimate of what it's going to cost, and then come back to me the next day, but maybe get them to keep proceeding, because what you don't want to do is to leave the job for 3 weeks while they're waiting for a quote to come through, but that's probably an exception to the rule rather than the norm. But have it all in writing. Yep. Don't do anything else.
And will a text suffice? I'll give you an example. So they're getting ready for the bathroom walls to be tiled and discovered that they're not plumb. They need to be packed out a bit and made plumb. So it's $700 or $800. Is the text going to do for that?
I would save the text.
Yeah.
The first thing I would do is just make sure that you do have a saved copy of what's. Written is written.
Yeah.
I think a text is still possibly not perfect, but it is a communication which you have both received electronically. And I don't see that it differs really from any other. An email is also electronic communication, and that's valid. So yes, I think you would do that. But again, it is important to record or save that text somewhere that you can't come back after and say, well, I didn't agree at all. That's not what I said, or something along those lines.
Yep.
And just look at language that's used a lot as well. That sometimes an estimate is an estimate, whereas a quote is sort of a firm price. And so estimates can go up and down, whereas a quote should not, unless there is a clear variation. Yeah, but again, just be careful when someone flips something back and say, our estimate's about $800. Is it 800 or is it 1,000 or what is it? I think they can be a little bit more specific. But the counterposition to that is if you make the builder responsible for every risk that comes up down to the dollar, they will inflate the price because they won't wear the risk. So say, for example, they think it's an $800 problem. You say, I want a firm price. Well, okay, it's $1,000. There's no justification on the fact that if it costs more than 800, they're not going to be the ones wearing it. So there are times, sometimes when you're doing it on day labour, which seems like a risky way to do it, but if you've got reliable contractors that you can trust, sometimes it's the fairest way of doing it for both parties because they don't know how long it's going to take. And if you ask them to firm up the price, they could end up loading the price to factor in their risk in that element of work. So it's a bit of swings and roundabouts sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that that's a fairly substantial outline of ways, or some ways, to manage your commitment to a builder. I'm going to create a little checklist for you to download to recapping on all these points, save you having to listen to this episode more than once. But the other thing I wanted to just, remind listeners of is the value of being in one of our programs, because there's quite a few ways that we have a framework for getting tenders that really addresses a lot of the risks around builders and contractors. We have Stephen as an authority in terms of if you've got a curly question, you can ask it in the Q&A and get the value of his 40 years of experience in the building industry, and also an MBA that specialises in contract administration. Is that what it is? Contract law? Yeah. And the other thing is that we also have an expert that we can refer you to if you are about to sign quite a substantial building contract, to review that contract with the view of protecting your rights as a consumer. And I think if you're building new or you are embarking on a large contract, that would be money well spent.
I think just in closing there as well, I think it's really important to, and I know a lot of us don't like doing this, but do read the contract. I know some of them can be pages, but they are written in fairly plain English. So it shouldn't be that difficult to navigate your way through. And if you don't understand something, ask them. Just don't be afraid to ask. If something doesn't make sense or you don't understand what it is, get them to explain it to you. They are asking you to sign their contract. You need to be clear what it is that you're signing up to. And I think one of the examples, which was slightly different, but where one of our students was buying an off-the-plan unit, he had this contract, which was a horrendous document. And in it actually gave the developer the right to, what's the word?
The sunset clause?
No, it was actually where they had complete control over the development. And what they were doing, they were building another building So it was a large site. This building, the apartment he was looking at was sort of in the first stage of the development, but the builder owned the rights over them,
The whole
the
site.
owners corporation, and it meant that they could override everyone else in the building in the event that they objected to the building which they were also going to build next door in a few years' time. So people's views and everything could have been, I'm not saying this did happen, could have been obscured, or they were selling them as sort of, because they may not have a water view in 3 years' time when the developer finishes doing this thing, and they can't complain about it because they don't have any rights. And all of that was very, I don't know what you say, concealed within all of the fine print of what because when you look, you think, oh, well, okay, they're going to be on the owners corporation. Can't be any harm in that. Well, there can be if they have 50% of the voting right, which is exactly what it said that they would do. So there are so many different areas where contracts are not written in the favour of the purchaser. And so, again, that is a different case, I appreciate. But as a result of that, the person didn't proceed with that unit on the basis of that information. He could have ended up with a very expensive error because an apartment that with a view might have had a dollar value, one without a view may have had a completely different and diminished value as a result of it. So,
Well, I hope this has shed some light on roofs, builders and contracts. So, and I hope the road noise hasn't been too disconcerting. And that's it for this week.
This is the She Renovates podcast. To discover how to harness the power of renovating, check out theschoolofrenovating.com.